Hello, everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. When last we left Monsieur Aronnax, Conseil, Ned Land, and the crew of the Nautilus, they had been exploring the ocean depths and encountering history itself, some ancient and some far more recent. These images of life and death, the struggles of mankind against the sea, seem to buoy the spirits of the enigmatic Captain Nemo, even as they give pause to our narrator. And it is with that we pick up today, with Chapter 20, Torres Strait. During the night of December 27th to 28th, the Nautilus left the shores of Vanikoro and cruised off at a high speed. We were headed southwest, and in 3 days we had covered the 2,000 miles separating La Perouse's islands from the southeast tip of New Guinea. Early on the morning of January the 1st, 1868, Conseil joined me on the platform. "With Monsieur's permission," he said, "I would like to wish Monsieur a Happy New Year." "What, Conseil? You act just as if I was still in Paris, in my office, next to the Botanical Gardens. But I accept your good wishes, and thank you. I would only like to know what you mean by a Happy New Year in our present situation. Will this year see the end of our imprisonment, or will it merely see us continuing our voyage?" "To tell the truth," replied Conseil, "I really don't know how to answer Monsieur's question. There's no doubt about it. We've been seeing many strange things, and for 2 months now we haven't even had time to be bored. Besides, the last marvel is always the most astonishing one, and if things keep getting better in this way, I can't imagine how they'll end. It's my opinion that we'll never see anything quite like this again." "Never again, Conseil." "And what's more, Captain Nemo really lives up to his name. He could scarcely bother us less if he didn't exist at all." Nemo is a Latin word meaning no man or nobody. Translator's note. "That's right. I therefore think, with Monsieur's permission, that a Happy New Year would be one which would allow us to see everything." "To see everything, Conseil? That would take a long time. But what does Ned Land think?" "Ned Land completely disagrees with me," answered Conseil. "He has a positive mind and a very demanding stomach. He's getting tired of looking at fish and eating nothing else day after day. He feels the lack of meat, bread, and wine. It's hard for a Saxon to go without his beefsteaks and his dash of brandy or gin." "As for me, Conseil, that isn't what bothers me, and I found it easy to get accustomed to the diet on board." "So have I," replied Conseil. "That's why I think as much about staying as Ned Land does about escaping. So if the coming year is bad for me, it will be good for him, and vice versa. This way, one of us is sure to be happy. But as for Monsieur, I wish him whatever will make him happy.
Thank you, Conseil. Only we'll have to put the New Year's presents off for some other time, and for now be content with a good handshake. That's all I have to give at the moment.
Monsieur was never so generous, answered Conseil. And with this, the fine young fellow was off. On January the 2nd, we had travelled 11,340 miles, or 5,250 leagues, from our point of departure in the Japan Sea. In front of the Nautilus's prow stretched the dangerous waters of the Coral Sea off the northeast coast of Australia. Our boat cruised several miles off this fearful shoal against which Cook's ships almost ran aground on June the 10th, 1770. Cook's vessel struck a rock, but it did not sink, thanks to the fact that the piece of coral it had hit came loose and stuck in the hull. I would have very much liked to visit this 1,000-mile-long reef against which waves broke with the intensity of thunderclaps. But just then, the Nautilus's side fins drew us down to a great depth, and I was able to see nothing of these high coral walls. I had to be content with the various specimens of fish brought up by our nets. Among others, I noticed some albacore, a species of mackerel about the size of a tuna, with bluish flanks and vertical stripes, which disappear when it dies. Whole schools of these fish accompanied us, and furnished our table with an excellent dish. We also brought in a large number of gilt heads, about 1/4 of an inch long, which tasted like dorado, and flying pyropedes, veritable underwater swallows, which on dark nights streak both air and water with their phosphorescent gleams. Among mollusks and zoophytes, I found in the meshes of the dragnet various species of Alcyonaria, sea urchins, hammer shells, spur shells, solaria, Cerithia, and Cavalinia. Plant life was represented by lovely floating seaweed, laminaria, and macrocystes, impregnated with the gum that seeps through their pores, and among which I picked out a marvellous Nemostoma galliniarioid, which was placed alongside the other curiosities of nature in the museum. 2 days after the crossing of the Coral Sea, on the 4th of January, we sighted the coast of New Guinea. It was then that Captain Nemo told me he intended to reach the Indian Ocean by passing through Torres Strait. But that was all he said. Ned was pleased to hear that we were drawing nearer to European waters. Torres Strait, which separates Australia and New Guinea, is dangerous not only because of its reefs, but also because of the savages who live along its coast. To the north lies New Guinea, 1,200 miles long and 400 miles wide, and with an area of 300,000 square miles. It is situated between 0 degrees 19 minutes and 10 degrees 2 minutes south latitude, and between 128 degrees 23 minutes and 146 degrees 15 minutes east longitude. At noon, while the first mate was shooting the sun, I could make out the summits of the Arfalks Mountains, rising in terraces, and then ending in sharp peaks.
just as a quick editorial note here, I have a feeling that the word that was used in this paragraph for the natives of the Torres Strait Islands and New Guinea will come up again. I think it's important to note that the 19th century attitudes towards indigenous peoples lack nuance in many respects, and I fear that this book will fall into the same trap. I do not endorse it, but I present it as it is, so that we can learn from our past experiences and be better in the future. Apologies if it offends any of our listeners. This island was discovered in 1511 by the Portuguese Francisco Serrano, and was then visited successively by Don José de Meneses in 1526, by Grijalva in 1527, by the Spanish general Alvar de Saavedra in 1528, by Inigno Ortez in 1545, by the Dutchman Schouten in 1616, by Nicholas Struik in 1753, by Tasman, Dampier, Fulmel, Carteret, Edwards, Bougainville, Cook, Forrest, McClure, by d'Entrecasteaux in 1792, by Duperrey in 1823, and by Dumont d'Urville in 1827. De Rienzi stated that this was the original home of the Negroes who occupied the Malay archipelago, and I felt certain that our hazardous course would bring us face to face with the fearful Andamanese. The Nautilus was, therefore, entering the most dangerous strait on earth, one which the bravest navigators had hardly dared to approach, which Luis Paz de Torres had confronted coming back from the South Seas in Melanesia, and which, in 1840, the grounded ships of Dumont d'Urville came near to going down with all hands. But the Nautilus, heedless of the sea's dangers, was about to navigate among these coral reefs. Torres Strait is about 100 miles wide, but it is obstructed by all kinds of islands, reefs, and rocks which make it nearly impossible to sail through. As a result, Captain Nemo took all the necessary precautions before entering it. Then he started out, cruising slowly along the surface. The Nautilus's propeller struck the water in a slow rhythm, like the tail of a huge whale. Taking advantage of this situation, my two companions and I stationed ourselves on the platform, which was, as always, deserted. Before us rose the helmsman's compartment, and I felt sure that Captain Nemo himself was inside, guiding his Nautilus. In my hands I held the splendid charts of Torres Strait made by the hydrographic engineer Vincendon de Moulin, with the assistance of Ensign Couvin des Bois, who was now an admiral, both of whom were part of Dumont d'Urville's staff during his last trip around the world. Along with those made by Captain King, these are the best charts with which to unravel the tangled web of this narrow passage, and I was following them closely. Around the Nautilus, the sea was boiling furiously. The current, travelling from southeast to northwest at a speed of 2.5 knots, broke over the corals emerging from the sea around us. "What an awful stretch of water," said Ned Land. "Terrible," I said, "and hardly suitable for a ship like the Nautilus." "That darned captain must be very sure of his course," because I can see bunches of coral that would only have to graze this hull to knock it into 1,000 pieces. It was, indeed, a dangerous situation, but the Nautilus slipped past these terrible reefs as if by magic. He did not follow the route of the astrolabe and the zélé, which had proved fatal to Dumont d'Urville. He went farther to the north, ran along Murray Island, and came back toward the southwest, near Cumberland Passage. I thought he would surely run aground once and for all when he took the ship through a large number of almost unknown little islands near Town Island and Evil Channel. I was wondering whether Captain Nemo, rash almost to the point of madness, intended to sail his ship through the strait where Dumont d'Urville's 2 corvettes had gone aground, when once again he changed his course and headed due west toward Gueboroa Island. It was then about 3 in the afternoon. The current was easing off. It was almost full tide. The Nautilus approached the island, which I can still see with its remarkable border of screw pines. We were less than 2 miles from its shore. Suddenly, a blow knocked me over. The Nautilus had just struck a reef. It remained immobile, listing slightly to port. When I got up, I saw that Captain Nemo and his first mate were on the platform. They were examining the ship's position, exchanging several words in their incomprehensible language. Here was our situation. 2 miles to starboard rose Gueboroa Island, whose coast extended from north to west like an immense arm. Towards the south and east, we could already make out the tops of several coral formations, which the ebb tide was beginning to uncover. We had gone aground at high tide, which would make it difficult to refloat the Nautilus. Nevertheless, the ship had suffered no damage, for her hull was solidly joined. But even though it could never sink or spring a leak, there was serious danger of its remaining grounded forever on these reefs, and that would be the end of Captain Nemo's submarine. I was thinking about all this when the captain came over, looking as cool and calm as ever. He seemed neither disturbed nor unhappy. "An accident?" I asked. "No, an incident," he replied. "But an incident," I retorted, "that will force you once again to live on that land you have been fleeing." Captain Nemo gave me an odd look and made a gesture of denial. It was his way of stating that nothing would ever force him again to set foot on land. He then said, "No, Monsieur Aronnax, the Nautilus is not lost. It will still take you through the wonders of the ocean. Our voyage is only beginning, and I have no desire to deprive myself so quickly of the honor of your company." "Nevertheless, Captain Nemo," I said, paying no attention to his irony, "the Nautilus went aground at high tide. Now, in the Pacific the tides are not strong, and if you can't unballast the Nautilus, which seems to me impossible, I don't see how it can be refloated." "You're right, Professor," replied Captain Nemo. "The tides in the Pacific aren't strong, but in Torres Strait there is, all the same, a difference of 5 feet between high and low tide. Today's the 4th of January, and in 5 days there'll be a full moon. Now, I'll be very surprised if this obliging satellite doesn't raise these waters and do me a service for which I will be very grateful to her." With this, Captain Nemo and the first mate went back inside the Nautilus. The ship no longer moved. It was immobile, as if embedded in a solid masonry of coral. "Well, monsieur?" said Ned Land, coming over to me after the captain left. "Well, Ned, we're going to wait calmly for the high tide of the 9th. It seems that the moon is going to be obliging enough to float us again."
"Just like that?"
"Just like that."
"And the captain isn't even going to try putting anchors out and heaving the boat off the reef with winches?"
"Why, if the tide will do the trick," said Conseil simply. The Canadian looked at Conseil and shrugged his shoulders. The sailor in him could not accept such a situation.
"Monsieur," he said, "believe me when I say that this hunk of iron will never again sail on the water or under it. It's only fit to be sold by the ton. So I think the time's come to part company with Captain Nemo."
"Ned, my friend," I answered, "I don't think the Nautilus's situation is as bad as you make out. In 4 days we'll know how much faith we can put in these Pacific tides. Besides, it would be one thing to think about escaping if we were off the coast of England or southern France, but in New Guinea it's another matter. And what's more, we'll have plenty of time to think about escaping if the Nautilus doesn't manage to get free of these reefs. But then we'll be in an even worse situation."
"But couldn't we even look over the ground a bit?" Ned Land continued. "There's an island over there. On that island there are trees. Under those trees there are animals carrying around chops and roast beefs, and I wouldn't mind a bit sinking my teeth into a little good meat."
"This time Ned's right," said Conseil. "I agree with him. Couldn't Monsieur get his friend Captain Nemo to take us to that island, if only so we don't forget how it feels to be on dry land?" "I can ask him," I said, "but he'll only refuse."
"We would appreciate it if Monsieur would give it a try, and then we'll know just how good the captain's intentions are."
To my great surprise, Captain Nemo not only granted me the permission I asked, but did it with great willingness and readiness, without even making me promise to come back on board. But escaping across New Guinea would have been very dangerous, and I would never have advised Ned Land to try it. It was better to be a prisoner on board the Nautilus than fall into the hands of the natives on that island. The dinghy was put at our disposal for the following morning. I did not ask whether or not Captain Nemo was going to come with us. I even felt sure that no member of the crew would accompany us, and that Ned Land would be left in charge of sailing the boat. Besides, it was less than 2 miles to shore, and the Canadian would have no trouble at all taking this light dinghy through the reefs so fatal to large ships. The next day, January the 5th, the dinghy was unlashed, taken out of its compartment, and launched from the platform. It only took 2 men to perform the entire operation. The oars were already in it, and we had only to take our places. At 8 o'clock, armed with guns and axes, we left the Nautilus. The sea was quite calm. A light breeze was coming from the land. Conseil and I were at the oars, rowing vigorously, and Ned steered us through the narrow passages between shoals. The dinghy proved easy to manage and scooted along at a brisk pace. Ned Land couldn't contain his joy. He was like a convict who had broken out of jail, and he didn't give a thought to the fact that he would have to return.
Meat,
He would keep on repeating.
we're going to eat meat, and what meat? Real game. And to think that we've never gotten any bread. I'm not saying I don't like fish, but you mustn't overdo a good thing. And it'll be nice for a change to have a piece of fresh venison grilled over a charcoal fire.
You glutton, said Conseil. Stop it. You're making my mouth water. We still don't know if there's game in these forests, I said, nor if what game there is might not be so big that it could hunt the hunter.
You may be right, Monsieur Aronnax,
replied the Canadian, whose teeth seemed to have been whetted like an axe blade.
But I'd eat sirloin of tiger if there were no other four-legged animals on this island.
Ned's beginning to make me nervous, said Conseil.
I don't care what kind it is, continued Ned Land, but the first animal I see with 4 feet and no feathers, or with 2 feet and feathers, will be greeted with a gunshot.
There you go, Ned, I said, flying off the handle again.
Don't worry about me, Monsieur Aronnax, replied the Canadian, and keep rowing. Before 25 minutes are up, I'll be able to offer you some really tasty dish.
At 8:30, the Nautilus's dinghy ran gently aground on a sandy beach, after safely passing through the coral reefs surrounding Gueboroa Island. Chapter 21. Several days ashore. I was quite excited to be on dry land again. Ned Land tested the ground with his foot as if he wanted to take possession of it. It had, nevertheless, been only 2 months since we had become what Captain Nemo called passengers aboard the Nautilus, but in reality, prisoners of its commander. Within a few minutes, we had walked several hundred yards inland. The ground was chiefly of coral formation, but several dried-out stream beds, strewn with bits of granite, showed that this island had been formed in an earlier geological epoch. Huge trees, sometimes reaching a height of 200 feet, were bound together with garlands of tropical vines, natural hammocks rocked by a light breeze. There were mimosas, banyans, casuaranias, teak trees, hibiscus, pendanus, and palm trees, mixed together in wild profusion. And beneath the shade of their green vaulting, at the foot of their gigantic trunks, grew orchids, leguminous plants, and ferns. But the Canadian did not even notice all these splendid specimens of New Guinea plant life. He preferred the useful to the attractive. He found a coconut tree, knocked down several coconuts, broke them open, and we drank the milk and ate the meat with a satisfaction that was like a protest against the everyday fare of the Nautilus.
Excellent, said Ned Land.
Exquisite, replied Conseil.
I shouldn't think Captain Nemo would object, said the Canadian, to our taking a store of coconuts on board.
I shouldn't think so, I answered, but he won't want to taste them himself. Too bad for him, said Conseil.
And all the better for us, retorted Ned Land. That'll leave us more of them.
But let me say one thing, Ned, I said to the harpooner as he was just about to put away another one. Coconuts are all very well and good, but before we fill the dinghy with them, it might be wise to find out if the island doesn't produce something more useful. It would be very nice to have fresh vegetables, for instance, on board the Nautilus.
Monsieur's right, answered Conseil, and I propose that we reserve 3 spaces in our boat, one for fruit, one for vegetables, and the third for venison, of which I haven't seen yet a single sign.
You must never give up, Conseil, replied the Canadian.
Let's be on our way, I said, and keep our eyes open. Even though this island appears to be uninhabited, we might still run into some individuals who aren't so fussy about what kind of game they hunt.
Ha ha, said Ned Land, moving his jaws significantly.
Goodness, Ned,
cried Conseil. Yes, retorted the Canadian. I'm beginning to understand the charms of cannibalism.
Ned, what are you saying? Cried Conseil. You, a cannibal? Why, it won't be safe being near you. Oh, and to think we share a cabin. Am I going to wake up one morning and find myself half-eaten?
Conseil, I like you a lot, but not enough to eat you. Unless I have to.
Oh, I still don't know if I can trust you, replied Conseil. But let's go on with our hunting. We must absolutely shoot some game to satisfy this cannibal, or else one of these mornings Monsieur will only find bits and pieces of a valet to serve him. During this conversation, we had entered the darker parts of the forest, and for 2 hours we explored it in every direction. We were lucky in our search for edible vegetables, and one of the most useful products of the tropics provided us with a food very much lacking on board. I am referring to the breadfruit tree, which is very abundant on Gueboroa Island. I noticed mainly the seedless kind, which in Malay is called rima. This tree was easily distinguishable from the others by its straight 40-foot trunk. Its top, gracefully rounded and crowned with large many-lobed leaves, was enough for a naturalist to instantly recognize the Artocarpus, which has been so successfully introduced into the Mascarene Islands. From its mass of greenery stood out a large round fruit, 4 inches in diameter, and covered with a skin wrinkled into hexagonal shapes. And this useful plant has been bestowed by nature on regions lacking in wheat. It requires no care and bears fruit 8 months of the year. Ned Land knew this fruit well. He had already eaten it on some of his many voyages, and he knew how to prepare it. The mere sight of it excited him, and he could no longer restrain himself.
Monsieur, he said, I'd die if I don't taste a bit of that breadfruit.
Go ahead, Ned. Take as much as you want. We're here to try things out.
It won't take long, replied the Canadian.
Using a lens, he started a fire of dead wood, which was soon crackling joyously. While he was doing this, Conseil and I chose the best breadfruit we could find. Some of them were not yet ripe enough, and their thick skin covered a white pulp almost without fibers. Others, in great numbers, were yellowish and gelatinous, only waiting to be picked. These fruits were without pits. Conseil brought a dozen or so to Ned Land, who cut them in thick slices and placed them on the hot coals. As he did this, he would say,
You'll see, monsieur, how good this bread is.
Especially after you haven't had any for a long time, said Conseil.
But it isn't really bread, added the Canadian. It's more like delicate pastry. Haven't you ever eaten any, monsieur?
No, Ned.
Well then, get ready for a real treat. If you don't come back for more, then I'm no longer the king of the harpooners.
After several minutes,
The part of the fruit exposed to the fire was completely toasted. Inside, it had turned into a kind of white paste which tasted something like an artichoke. This bread really was excellent, and I ate it with great relish. But unfortunately, I said, bread like this can't be kept fresh, so it seems useless to store it on board. Uh-huh, monsieur, cried Ned Land. Maybe that's what naturalists think. But now that I'm the baker, I've got other ideas. Conseil, gather up a bunch of this fruit and we'll take it with us when we go back. But how will you prepare it? I asked the Canadian. By making a fermented paste out of its pulp, which will then keep indefinitely without going bad. And when I want some, I'll cook it in the kitchen on board, and in spite of a slightly acidy flavor, you'll find it still very good. So, Master Land, I see that with this bread we'll have everything we want. No, Professor. We'll still need some fruit, or at least a few vegetables. Well then, let's look for some fruit and vegetables. We finished collecting the breadfruit, and then set out to complete this on-shore dinner. Our search did not prove to be in vain, for towards noon we had gathered a considerable stock of bananas. These delicious products of the torrid zone ripen throughout the year, and the Malays, who call them pisang, eat them without cooking them. Along with these bananas, we also gathered some enormous jacks, a fruit with a very strong flavour, some delicious mangoes, and some pineapples of unbelievable size. And even though it took us a long time to collect all this, we felt no regrets at having done so. I find it fascinating that the author decides to explain to us what bananas are. It's sort of difficult to recollect in these modern days of supermarkets and relatively easy food that back in the 19th century and before, tropical fruits were the kind of thing that one might see only once in a lifetime. I recall stories of nobles in Europe, France and England, who would actually rent a pineapple for their parties, not to eat, but just as a centerpiece to their grand table spread, a show of their taste, sophistication, and opulent wealth. Nowadays, I think we find pineapples in their natural form even a bit too much trouble to actually eat. They taste better than when they're canned, but a can opener is much easier to accomplish than slicing and skinning the fruit without getting stabbed by its nasty barbs. I love too that he mentions jacks. Jackfruit is becoming much more popular nowadays for its similarity to pulled pork or other barbecued meats, and is used in many vegan recipes. I've tried it, and it's really good. Heartily recommend it. Though I've never tried breadfruit. That I still have to do. Conseil was always watching Ned. The harpooner walked in front, picking up more fruit along the way to complete our provisions. Now do we have everything we need, Ned? Said Conseil. Remarked the Canadian. What is there to complain about?
Oh, these vegetables and fruit don't make a meal, answered Ned. They're just the end of a meal, dessert. But what about the soup? What about the roast?
That's right, I said. Ned promised us some chops, but I don't quite see where we're going to find them.
Monsieur, answered the Canadian, our hunting expedition hasn't even begun. Patience. We'll find some sort of animal, and if not here, then some other place.
And if not today, then tomorrow,
added Conseil. Besides, we shouldn't wander too far off. In fact, I propose we go back to the dinghy.
What? Already? Cried Ned.
We have to get back before nightfall, I said.
What time is it then?
It's at least 2, answered Conseil.
How time flies on the shore,
cried the Canadian with a sigh of regret. Let's go, replied Conseil. So we went back through the forest. On the way, we completed our harvest by picking up some palm cabbages, which we had to get out of the tops of trees, some small beans, which I recognized as being the kind the Malays call abru, and yams of excellent quality. We were heavily loaded down when we arrived at the dinghy, but Ned Land still felt he didn't have enough. But luck was with him. Just as he was about to get into the boat, he noticed several trees, 25 or 30 feet high, belonging to the palm family. These trees, as precious as the breadfruit, are justly considered among the most useful products of Malaysia. They were sago palms, plants which grow wild and reproduce themselves, like mulberry trees, by means of both shoots and seeds. Ned Land knew what to do with these trees. He took his axe and started chopping vigorously. He had soon felled 2 or 3 sago palms. We could tell they were full grown by the white dust covering their branches. I watched him, more as a naturalist than as a starving man. He began removing from each trunk a band of bark about an inch thick, which covered a network of elongated fibers, forming inextricable knots, cemented together by a kind of gummy flour. This flour was the sago itself, an edible substance which is the principal diet of the Melanesians. For the moment, Ned Land did no more than cut these trunks up into pieces, as one would do for firewood. Later, he would take out the flour, pass it through a cloth to separate it from the fibrous ligaments, let it dry out in the sun, and then put it in molds to harden. Finally, at 5 in the afternoon, loaded down with all our booty, we left the island, and half an hour later we were alongside the Nautilus. No one came out to greet us. When we had brought our provisions on board, I went down to my room. I found my supper ready. I ate and then went to sleep. On the next day, January 6th, nothing had changed on board. There was not a sound inside the submarine, not a single sign of life. The dinghy was still alongside, exactly as we had left it. We resolved to go back to Gueboroa Island. Ned Land hoped to have more luck hunting than on the day before, and he wanted to try another part of the forest. We were off at dawn. The tidal current was with us, and in no time at all we arrived at the island. We got out, and thinking it might be better to follow the Canadian's instincts, we let him be the leader, and he soon threatened to outdistance us with his long strides. Ned Land headed westward from the coast, and then, after fording several streams, he reached a high plain bordered by splendid forests. We saw several kingfishers near the streams, but they wouldn't let us approach them. Their caution proved to me that these birds knew what to expect from 2-legged creatures like us, and I concluded that if this island was not inhabited, it was, at least, frequently visited by human beings. After crossing a fairly rich prairie, we reached the edge of a little forest filled with the singing of birds as they flitted from tree to tree. "They're only birds," said Conseil.
"You can still eat them,"
answered the harpooner.
"But, Ned,"
said Conseil.
I don't see anything but ordinary parrots.
Conseil, my friend, replied Ned gravely, a parrot is like a pheasant to someone who has nothing else to eat.
And what's more, I said, if it's cooked right, it makes a very good dish. And indeed, beneath the thick foliage of this forest, a whole world of parrots flitted from branch to branch, awaiting only a more careful education to speak the language of human beings. As it was, they chattered away, accompanied by many-coloured parakeets, grave-looking cockatoos who seemed to be meditating some philosophical problem. White, brilliant red lorries passed by like pieces of bunting carried off by the wind, and in the midst of chaos, with their noisy flight, Papuas with their fine shadings of blue, and all sorts of other birds that were charming but inedible. Nevertheless, one kind, which is seen only in these regions and which never passes the limit of the Aru Islands and New Guinea, was lacking in this collection. But I was lucky enough to be able to see it before long. After crossing a fairly thick copse, we came upon a plain covered with shrubs. There I saw rise a flock of magnificent birds whose long feathers were so arranged that they had to fly into the wind. Their undulating flight, the graceful curves they described in the air, and their shimmering colours made one look at them in wonder. I had no difficulty recognizing them. Birds of paradise. Odor of Passiformes, section of Clistomorae,
replied Conseil. Family of partridges? Asked Ned Land. I don't think so, Ned, but I'm counting on your skill to capture one of these charming specimens of the tropics. I'll try, Professor, even though I'm handier with a harpoon than with a gun.
The Malays, who carry on a brisk trade in these birds with the Chinese, have various methods for catching them, none of which we could use. Sometimes they put snares in the tops of the high trees where these birds perch, and sometimes they use a strong glue that paralyzes their movements. And they even go so far as to poison the springs where these birds go to drink. But all we could do was try shooting them in flight, which left us little chance of getting one. And in fact, we used up a good part of our ammunition in vain. By 11 in the morning, we had reached the foothills of the mountains, which cover the centre of the island, and we had, as yet, killed nothing. We were beginning to feel terrible pangs of hunger. We had relied on what we would be able to kill, and we had made a mistake. But Conseil, and to his great surprise, brought down 2 birds, and thus assured us our lunch. They were a white pigeon and a ring-dove. We quickly removed their feathers, put them on a spit, and roasted them over a fire. While they were cooking, Ned prepared some breadfruit. Then the pigeon and the ring-dove were devoured right down to the bone, and declared excellent. The nutmeg on which they'd gorged themselves perfumed their flesh and made it delicious to eat. It's as if chickens were fed on truffles, said Conseil. And what do we lack now, Ned? I asked.
4-legged game, Monsieur Arnax, replied Ned Land. All these pigeons are no better than an hors d'oeuvre, something to whet your appetite. I won't be happy until I've killed an animal with chops on it. And I won't be happy, Ned, until I catch a bird of paradise.
So, let's keep on hunting, answered Conseil, but heading back towards the coast. We've reached the foothills of the mountains, and I think it would be best if we returned towards the forest region.
It was a good piece of advice, and we followed it. After walking for an hour, we reached a veritable forest of sago palms. Several harmless snakes scurried away beneath our feet. The birds of paradise fled at our approach, and I had given up hope of ever getting one, when Conseil, who was out in front, suddenly bent down, let out a cry of victory, and came back to me, carrying a magnificent bird of paradise. "Good work, Conseil!" I cried.
"Monsieur is too kind," replied Conseil.
"No, my boy, that was a stroke of genius, taking one of these birds alive, and with your bare hands."
"But if monsieur would examine it closely, he would see that there is no great merit in what I did."
"Why not, Conseil?"
"Because this bird is as drunk as a lord."
"Drunk?"
"Yes, monsieur. Drunk from all the nutmeg he had eaten under the nutmeg tree where I caught him. Look, Ned, you can see the terrible effects of drunkenness."
Good Lord," retorted the Canadian. "Considering the amount of gin I've had in the last 2 months, you haven't got much grounds for accusing me of drunkenness." In the meanwhile, I examined this strange bird. Conseil was right. This bird of paradise had become drunk to the point of being powerless. It could not fly and could scarcely walk. But this didn't disturb me, and I just let it sleep off the effects of the nutmeg. This bird belonged to the loveliest of the 8 species found on New Guinea and neighboring islands. It was the green emerald bird of paradise, one of the rarest kinds. It was about a foot long, with a relatively small head and tiny eyes placed near the base of its beak. But it displayed a marvelous range of colors. Yellow head, yellow beak, brown feet and claws, hazel wings with purple tips, emerald throat, and chestnut brown stomach and chest. 2 long, slim, thread-like feathers, shaped like downy horns, rose above its tail and completed the ensemble of this marvelous bird, which natives have poetically named the sunbird. I wanted, very much, to bring this superb specimen of a bird of paradise back to Paris and present it to the botanical gardens, which didn't possess one alive.
"You mean to say they're very rare?" asked the Canadian, in the tone of voice of a hunter whose interest in game is not exactly artistic. "Very rare, my friend, and above all very difficult to capture alive. And even when dead, these birds are the object of an important commerce, to the point where the natives have hit on the idea of fabricating them, just as others forge pearls or diamonds."
"What?"
cried Conseil.
"There are people who make fake birds of paradise?"
"Yes, Conseil."
"Does monsieur know how the natives do it?"
"Yes. During the monsoon season, these birds of paradise lose their magnificent tail feathers, which naturalists call the subulary feathers. The bird counterfeiters pick up these feathers, which they then cleverly attach to some poor parakeet they have already altered to suit their purposes. They then dye the place where the feathers were joined on, varnish the entire bird, and send it off to European museums or collectors."
"Yes," said Ned Land, "but even if you've got the wrong bird, you've at least got the right feathers. And once you don't intend to eat it, I don't see what difference it makes."
Although my desires had been fulfilled by the capture of this bird of paradise, those of our Canadian hunter had not yet been satisfied. Fortunately, at about 2 o'clock,
Ned Land brought down a splendid wild boar, a kind the natives call Tang. This creature seemed to have turned up especially to bring us real meat from a four-legged animal, and his arrival was very welcome. Ned Land was proud of his shot. The boar had been hit with the electric bullet and had fallen down, stone dead. The Canadian skinned and cleaned it, and then removed a half-dozen chops to be grilled for our evening meal. Then once again we set out hunting. For Ned and Conseil were to perform yet more exploits. And, in fact, these two friends, by beating the bushes, flushed a herd of kangaroos, which fled, bounding along on their huge hind legs, but they did not flee so fast that our electric bullets could not stop them. "Ah, Professor!" cried Ned Land, carried away by the excitement of hunting. "What marvelous meat, especially when it's braised. Oh, what a supply for the Nautilus. We've got 2, 3, 5. And to think we'll have it all to ourselves without those imbeciles on board even having a mouthful." I think that if Ned, in his over-excitement, had not talked so much, he would have massacred the entire herd. But he was content with a dozen of these, as Conseil put it, interesting marsupials, which form the first order of aplacental mammals. They were small, and belonged to a species of rabbit kangaroo which lives in hollowed-out trees and can travel at great speed. But although their size is not great, their meat is highly esteemed. We were very satisfied with the results of our hunting. Ned was delighted and suggested coming back to this enchanted island the next day. He probably would have liked to depopulate it of all its edible quadrupeds, but he did not count on what was to happen. At 6 in the afternoon, we were back on the beach. Our dinghy was grounded in its usual spot. The Nautilus looked like a long reef 2 miles from shore. Ned Land, without any further delay, set to work on the important matter of dinner. He was very expert in this kind of cooking. The chops from the Utang, grilled over a charcoal fire, were soon filling the air with a delicious odor. But here I am talking like Ned Land, in ecstasy over freshly grilled pork. Please excuse me, for the same reasons I excused Ned Land. In short, the dinner was excellent. 2 ringdoves rounded out this unusual menu. Some sago paste, a bit of breadfruit, several mangoes, a half a dozen pineapples, and the fermented liquor from certain kinds of coconuts, all helped to put us in a very joyous state. It seems, even to me, that my 2 companions' brains were, perhaps, a bit clouded. "What if we don't go back to the Nautilus tonight?" said Conseil. "What if we don't ever go back?" added Ned Land. But just then, a stone landed at our feet, cutting short the harpooner's proposition. And that, my friends, is where we will leave it, on a cliffhanger. I hope you'll join me next time on Soft Stories to experience what happens to our friends and whether, in fact, they do make it back to the Nautilus, that reef 2 miles from shore that seems at once all too close and, in a situation like this, all too distant. Thank you again so much for joining me, and I hope I will see you again soon. But until then, I must wish you all the best, and goodbye.